Good morning. On behalf of NYSAC President Jack Marin and NYSAC Executive Director Stephen Aquario, we want to thank and we want to welcome you, our NYSAC members and guests that have joined us today for a webinar on the American Jobs Plan and what it really might do for states and local governments. After more than a decade of starving our infrastructure and capital needs projects, particularly at the local level, we are on the cusp of a potentially lifetime opportunity to invest in our infrastructure and the future of our economies at the local level. Thank you for joining us. Jeanette, are there any housekeeping we need to clarify at this time?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Just to let you know, as usual, we will be recording this session and we will post the recording on the NYSAC website under webinars. If you go under the education tab and click on webinars, you will find this session under today's date. We'll also be posting not only the recording, but a PDF of the slide deck. If you have questions during the webinar, please submit them via the questions tab of your dashboard. We ask you to submit questions in writing so that we have a moment at the end to do a Q&A and we will read all questions. I think that's about it. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeanette Stanziano. Jeanette is our Director of Training and Education, and she will be running our webinar this morning. Thanks again, Jeanette. On behalf of NYSAC, I would like to thank our sponsor and our webinar this morning. It's Envision Strategy Llc. They're a government relations and strategic consulting firm dedicated to achieving success for their clients. From their offices in Albany and Washington, their firm provides local, state, and federal government affairs representation to the private sector and government, combined with full-service federal and state grants consulting for their clients. We are grateful for Envision Strategy support in helping NYSAC to inform and educate our county officials from across the state. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers this morning. First, we have Congressman Tim Bishop, former member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and ranking member of the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment. Thank you for joining us this morning, Congressman.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Steve Stallmer, a former House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee staffer for Congressman Jack Quinn and Chris Gibson. Brett Heimov, former House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee staffer for Congressman Jerrold Nadler. Anthony Pugliese, former senior advisor to the White House for the Department of Transportation. David Carroll, government affairs professional who has represented transportation agencies in New York. Steve Schultz, former U.S. Senate professional staff member on the Joint Economic Committee. Thank you all for joining us. And now I would like to turn it over to Steve Stallmer. Steve.
Good morning, everybody. My name, I think, is wrong on the bottom of that, irrelevant. Brett's tied up, so I think we just we'll go with this. And if you have any questions, direct them to Steve. So I guess if you call Brett, I'll figure it out anyway. We'll go forward with it. Good morning. Are the slides, Jeanette, available for me to see now or no? You guys, Tim, do you see yours?
No.
Are we supposed to, is that supposed to appear on our screen? There we go.
Here we go, Steve.
There we go. All right, now we're talking. Can everybody see that? Assume they can. Tim, you can see that now?
I can.
Okay, all right, so we're ready to roll. Okay, thank you, Jeanette. We're gonna run through a little history of where we were, because it always is a good indicator of where we're going. So, as I said in the introduction, for most of us, we've worked on these bills for probably decades now, and I go way back to when they were T21 and ICE-T and TLU, if anybody remembers those names. Those were past transportation bills that massively increased investment in our infrastructure system. And at that time, it was really focused on two core elements of transportation: a highway program for roads and bridges, and mass transit assistance. Obviously in New York, the largest recipient of that is the MTA down in New York City, but it did support upstate transit systems like those in Buffalo and the Capital District, CDTA, and others, Rochester, throughout the state. So back then, this is the 90s, early 2000s, they drastically increased the amount of funding available for the highway bills by making sure that the money in the dedicated highway and bridge trust fund was specifically that, dedicated to those expenditures. And it was a bit of a floor fight to get that figured out. But once they did that, they created a floor. And since then, no Congress has wanted to kind of cut back on the amount of spending that was available for transportation programs. And so what happened was the money that was in the trust fund supported a certain level, and that was the floor. And as we continued forward, the value of the trust fund decreased, mostly because cars got more fuel efficient. It's more electric cars, and so there's less funding of the gas tax into the highway bridge trust fund. So every time you fill up your gas, there's a 18.4 cents per gallon goes into the trust fund. That number has been flat since the early 90s. That is a challenge when that is the dedicated stream for funding these projects. With that now not being raised in forever, the amount of money they want to spend on the transportation bill and this plan that we're going to run through is multiple $1 trillion, over $2 trillion total that the president proposed. If you want to spend that kind of money on transportation and infrastructure, you're going to need to find a new source of revenue. And that's we're going to focus a little bit on that later, because that is going to be probably the key to whether or not this whole thing can come together. And then the last point on kind of the history of these bills is, as I said, it used to purely be transportation, roads, bridges, mass transit. Now, through the last couple of Congress, mostly the last Congress, and now with President Biden, we have expanded that definition to include improvements to the electrical grid, rural broadband development, water, wastewater systems, and then maybe even some vertical building construction in the form of schools, hospitals, kind of public benefit areas. So it is a much broader definition of infrastructure than it used to be. And so when we talk about this plan that the president proposed, the American Jobs Plan, and its impact on local governments, there's kind of two tracks to remember. You have the kind of the original traditional highway bill, which will still be just roads and bridges. And then on top of that, you will have all the newer forms of infrastructure that have totally haven't totally been defined, but are being added into this process. And at some point they will get merged. We'll discuss more about that. But just as for historical background, they established a floor. No one wants to go backwards. In order to continue that steady growth on infrastructure investment, we're going to need a new revenue source, because there's not enough money being generated through the gas tax. So with that said, we'll get into some of those other things that I laid out. And I think, Tim, you're going to take it from there.
Well, the transportation bill, or the so-called American Jobs Act, has four pieces to it. It has traditional transportation. It has traditional, what we refer to as traditional transportation infrastructure. It has what's being referred to as home infrastructure, what's being referred to as care infrastructure, and lastly, innovation and R&D infrastructure. The transportation piece of it is essentially a traditional surface transportation bill grafted on top of a bill that totals $2.3 trillion of expenditures over 8 years. So the traditional pieces you can see on your screen. 85 billion for public transit, 80 billion for passenger and rail freight service, airports, inland waterways, coastal ports, traditional highway things, 110 billion for drinking water, $100 billion for investment in broadband. The goal is to bring broadband to literally every home in the country. So all of that is I would say that, and I'm sort of jumping ahead here, but we have to try to cover a lot in a short period of time. Of the 4 pieces of infrastructure that comprise the Jobs Act, traditional transport infrastructure is likely to survive into law in something approaching its current form. And I think pieces of the home infrastructure bill are likely to survive into law in something approaching its current form. And we're going to talk about passage in a bit. My own view is that the care infrastructure piece, which is $400 billion for expanding access to quality, affordable in-home health care, primarily for the elderly and the permanently disabled. I don't think that will get addressed, at least in this context. And the R&D infrastructure piece, and Steve, correct me if you disagree, but I don't think that's going to get addressed in this piece as well. So for the purposes of this call and what it's going to mean for counties, we're talking about a traditional surface transportation bill, which is priced at about $600 billion over 8 years, which in the context of former bills such as the ones that Steve referred to, safety, Lou, ICE-T, and so on, is not an extraordinary amount of money. $600 billion over 8 years. So it's, it's round numbers, 700 billion a year, 70 billion a year, pardon me. So not a huge departure from what we've done in the past. And the home infrastructure piece is a departure, but it includes things that have broad, support and broad recognition needed. So upgrade of schools, upgrade of the community college infrastructure, upgrade in wastewater and stormwater and drinking water infrastructure. All of those things have a history of bipartisan support and may not be funded to the extent that is currently contemplated. But my guess, and again, Steve, correct me if you feel differently, we'll get at least some support going forward. Steve?
Yeah, that's right. Why don't we go to the next, please, Jeanette, and we'll a little more talk a little bit of, we kind of alluded to this, Tim, and I'll give you my 2 cents and we'll go forward. I think the point of just laying out everything that's in this besides the traditional highway bill, for those listening on the call, our opinion is you're going to have many more options this time for project submission, project funding. We'll get into kind of the detail of project submissions, and Steve Schultz is going to talk about kind of with the earmark process. But if there's anything to take from that last slide with those numbers that are really aggressive and ambitious, is it's a much broader definition, which is going to give you many more options to look at within your county, within your local government. What is available? What kind of projects are you been trying to get funded? Do you have on the shelf? Do you have things that you would like to try to move forward with that haven't had the resources, or to start planning for things that, because this is a multi-year bill, can you speed something up? Can you get something ready? Can you get something in the queue quick enough that it will be able to be eligible for funding throughout the life of this bill? I alluded to this in the beginning, that the funding, this is going to most likely result in the bill being a Democratic only supported piece of legislation. There is a lot of conversations about making it a broad bipartisan bill. Infrastructure and transportation bills historically are bipartisan. Everybody wants to fix their local roads and bridges. However, the funding is the tricky part and is the part that is partisan. This bill recommends increasing the corporate tax rate from the current 21% level to 28%. If you recall, in 2017, after President Trump was elected, his kind of main achievement with the Republican Congress, when they had complete control of everything as the Democrats do now, was a massive tax, the American Jobs and Tax Cut Act. I think it was a technical name, but it was basically a tax cut for corporations, and they phased out some deductions and stuff like that to be able to lower the corporate tax rate from 35 all the way down to 21. That bill was passed with all Republican votes, very similar to the position we're in now when the Democrats want to undo that and increase the rate back up to 28. The interesting element here is, of course, when you only have 50 senators, if you don't have all 50 Democratic senators that you need to pass this with, you can't lose a single vote. Senator Manchin has already come out and said that he doesn't want to increase it to 28. 25 is his max. And he says he has others that have similar concerns that he's talked to. So it looks like that major funding mechanism from 21 to 28 is going to be diminished potentially to 25. They are also going to, as the second bullet says, tighten the number of international tax enforcement provisions that were in that Trump tax law. We don't have an estimate yet on how much those changes generate and how much money will be available to spend on this. That is the legislative and congressional sausage making process that's going to take place over the next couple of months. But whatever that the bill is going to be dictated by whatever that level is. If they can get to 2 trillion, they'll spend 2 trillion. If they can get to 1.8, they'll spend 1.8. I don't think Republicans are going to be on board with any of these tax increases. So we are looking at a reconciliation process down the line. I think right now we're still in the courting phase. I think the president had some Republicans over at the White House yesterday to try to continue to court them and get them on board. So this could pass with bipartisan support, but it looks like we are headed towards reconciliation. Tim, jump in if you have anything else on that.
Yeah, a couple things. One, I think Steve's assessment of the current state of play is correct. Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, is currently the most powerful guy in Washington, and he has made it clear that 28% is a bridge too far for him, and that he's more comfortable with 25. Now, if it goes to 25, the implications for that over a 15-year period, which is the funding expectation that the 8 years of expenditures would be paid for with 15 years of tax increases. The funding implication is significant, and thus the scope of what could be accomplished under the Jobs Act would be restricted significantly. The other thing I would say is that the traditional method of funding transportation infrastructure, the so-called motor vehicles fuels tax, no longer has the impact it once had for multiple reasons. A, as Steve indicated, it has not changed since 1993. Two, because of increased fuel efficiency of vehicles, the income to the trust fund has declined. And three, as COVID-related transportation implications continue to reverberate, people simply aren't commuting to work the way they once did. And so all in all, the Highway Trust Fund just doesn't have the impact that it used to have. There is, though, zero, as I can tell, zero chance that an increase in the motor fuels tax will pass. If it could get out of the House, which I think is unlikely, there's no way it gets 10 votes, 10 Republican votes in the Senate. And then there's other things being talked about, a vehicle miles traveled device that would basically charge users relative to the extent to which they use our surface transportation resources. That is controversial in its own right. There's some talk about increasing taxes for trucking. That also is controversial. So I think that the ability to achieve any of the aspirations associated with the transpo infrastructure piece will come down to reconciliation. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but that is much easier to say than it is to achieve. And again, Senator Manchin plays into this, Senator Sinema plays into this, and so on. But and then the other, to take you into the weeds, if we go with reconciliation, the funding mechanism can only be laid out over a 10-year period, not a 15-year period. So again, that's taking you into the weeds. But suffice it to say that funding for the bill is problematic, significantly so.
Next, please, Jeanette.
Hey everyone, this is Steve Schultz. I'm going to take over for a few slides here. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what the project request system looks like within the Transportation Reauthorization Bill, and then tie that back to the appropriations process and congressionally directed funding there. As Tim and Steve alluded, there's a big change that's happened this year with this transportation package, and it covers a lot of different things in Congress, which is actually having congressional direction for projects specifically. So now members of Congress are allowed to request projects that can happen in this transportation bill, but then also appropriations in general. We're going to talk about what those project requests look like. So, you know, within the transportation bill, and we'll start there, the projects, there's been, you know, a good amount of guidance on the projects front, and up until recently, they actually had to extend the project submittal deadline, because obviously these are huge projects, and you'll see on the next slide the things that folks needed to get their ducks in a row on was pretty significant. And really only folks that had projects that had a lot of work done, already had their stakeholders involved, already had, you know, were on the approved list with state DOTs, had local municipal and county government support, are really able to compete here. So the current project requests are due on April 23rd, and only members of Congress are allowed to make those requests to the committee. So unlike appropriations, where you can work with Congressman Tonko on trying to get a local community center funded or something along those lines in a specific bill, this process, you would have to amass the information, and you can go to the next slide. You would have to amass the information here that's listed below, and this is the committee's guidance on what needs to happen, and that's due on April 23rd. So members of Congress, like, you know, Congressman Bishop would have done, is worked with local stakeholders, government, transportation authorities, et cetera, to put together this information and then submit it to the committee. And, you know, they include being on the, being listed on the STIP program, have, you know, the amount of money, you know, obviously that you would need and the support for that, state DOT support, project description, your environmental review status, your NEPA category, et cetera. And so, and then lastly, a certification to member the spouse has no, or immediate family has no economic interest. And really, with this process, and then the process we'll talk about in a second with earmarks, they're trying to have a much more transparent process where things are, I think, attributable to specific members. A lot of that language is out there, and a lot of folks like on the call here, county government, local government, are going to have a transparent say in the game, and that constituents and folks will be able to track these projects and understand. So all of this information is going to be available publicly. And you can go on to the next slide. So again, like I said before, this project request system is part of a broader kind of movement, not only in the transportation bill, but then also in appropriations and what were formerly known as earmarks. And so if I go through my bullets, congressionally directed spending is, and I think what the chairwoman of the committee is calling them in her language was a community project, something along those lines. You earmarks obviously had a negative connotation that was part of some of the negative press that they've received in the, 2009 to 2011 timeframe, where you had the bridge to nowhere. It's interesting, but George Washington actually funded a lighthouse into Virginia through an earmark, and they've been around, obviously since the beginning of the country. They first came to real prominence in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and county governments, and I worked with many county governments, local, municipal governments, hospitals, higher education, had many projects funded through this process, where a congressperson would request funding for a specific project, split up in the appropriations bill, which is a budget bill that funds the government on an annual basis. That committee is split into 11 different subcommittees. They're all separated by issue area, like transportation, housing and urban development, or state and foreign operations, commerce, justice, state, et cetera, and split up into federal agencies, et cetera. And so around, like I said, 2009 to 2011, they'd received a lot of negative press, partly because of a transportation bill earmark called the Bridge to Nowhere, which was in Alaska. But it really brought to light, I think, several members were doing untoward things. There was also, I think, waste periodically. However, I do think, and this is coming from a lobbyist, but they're incredibly important congressional, but really constitutional responsibility with the power of the purse to Congress. And certainly Congress is going to know a lot better their district than somebody in Washington. And I think that that process really helps legislation happen, as we all kind of recognize. So there's been a slow movement since 2011 to get back to the point where we can have projects in bills again. And so when first the Republicans and then Democrats stopped all congressional direction and projects, that impacted the transportation bill and appropriations. And so this year is the first year that they're back, and they're back in a more limited way. Only nonprofits, local governments, et cetera, can receive any earmarks. And this again is being driven starting in the House, because the House has the power of the purse. And the way that the bills are split up now in those 11 areas are more prescriptive. Before there was a lot, I think, of latitude that members had, where they could put certain projects into certain bills, and there was a lot of kind of gamesmanship and horse trading that went on with trying to get certain projects funded and doing things in several bills. That's no longer the case. It's much more focused now, and there's specific committee guidance as to which bills will work and which projects will work in which bills, and it's something to consider, which is why members have been taking a lot of time, because they only have 10 projects, which is far fewer than they used to be able to do. 1, and 2, they need to fit into those specific bills and be correct. If you only have 10 shots to take, you want to make sure that you're not going to get caught up on a newly hammered out process and have it be more restrictive. So right now, the committee requires all that the deadline for these project requests is April in the 28th to 30th timeframe, depending on the committee. Now, members individually make those requests, and constituents like yourselves would go to that member, and I think Ryan mentioned it before, the form that we had passed along as an example of this appropriations form. Those have been due anywhere from the end of March to last week. And most, probably if not all members, deadlines for submittal to their personal offices are already done. Then they will take those, they will vet them, they'll make sure they work. They'll make sure that they're meeting certain criteria that the congressperson wants to make sure that are there, that they're a community need, that they have stakeholder support, that they are either driving jobs or meeting some type of critical community deliverable. Because now there's going to be a lot more focus on what these projects look like, and they're going to have to be so far above board and defendable and important, and obviously to a nonprofit or to a local government, that they want to make sure they have their ducks in a row before they get them over to the committee. The committee is going to require those by the 28th to the 30th, and then the legislative process will begin. And that process happens every year, unlike the transportation bill, which has, in theory, should run every 5 years. Appropriations happens every year. And so why our team is talking about this today, I think that you would have, as a county, elected official or staff member, it's really what you're going to do next year. Some of y'all may have projects already in those bills, and we can talk about what that process looks like during Q&A. But I think it's important for everyone on the call to think about what projects are going to go, looking at that process, seeing what's successful, seeing how it changes, and also seeing how the Senate impacts this, because everything I've been talking about thus far is House side. Senate side still hasn't decided what their process is going to look like. So that is a big question mark. But we do know that they most likely will happen and will happen in the order that the House wants. So that's it, kind of in a nutshell. We can do Q&A at the end here, and I'll be managing that. But that's just to get you guys a flavor for projects in Congress, but then projects specifically in both bills and what that looks like. So Tim, I turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much. This discussion of potential passage and moving forward, of necessity, essentially everything that we're going to say is speculative, in that no one, and I mean no one, knows how this is going to play out with any degree of certainty or any degree of specificity as the weeks and months pass. There are basically two processes happening. One is the passage of the traditional surface transportation bill, which highway programs need to be reauthorized by September 30th. That process is now underway in the House. The goal is to pass a surface transportation bill out of committee, that is to say the T&I committee, by Memorial Day, and to pass out of the House by the end of July. What is likely to happen, and I underline likely but certainly not certain, is that that surface transportation bill will become co-joined with this larger infrastructure package, because the surface transportation bill in the House will not have a funding mechanism. It is simply coming through the T&I committee. It does not have a Ways and Means Committee piece to it that would provide the funding mechanism. So it is likely that it will be co-joined with this larger infrastructure bill, pieces of which will be assembled by multiple committees in both the House and the Senate. House passage is not a guarantee, in that the margin in the House right now, the Democratic Party is the majority party, but with the death of Congressman Alcee Hastings last week, the Democrats can afford to lose two Democratic votes for passage, unless they pick up some Republican votes. Hard to predict the future, and this is not a partisan comment, but it is unlikely that there will be much, if any, Republican support for the larger infrastructure package. Possible, because transportation has always historically been bipartisan, but the scope of the package suggests that that's going to be harder, and there's going to be a ratio. To the extent that the bill grows in dollars, that reduces the likelihood of Republican support. But let's assume it comes out of the House, which I think is a reasonable, though not guaranteed, assumption. It then goes to the Senate. As you know, that the Senate is split 50-50. The Democrats are considered the majority party because Vice President Harris possesses the tie-breaking vote. You also know that the passage of most pieces of legislation in the Senate require a supermajority of 60 votes. So again, just math. In order for this to pass, you need all 50 Dems, and you need at least 10 Republicans for that to happen. Now, Minority Leader McConnell has already made clear that the package as currently crafted will receive 0 Republican support, but it also doesn't have at the present time unanimous Democratic support. As both Steve and I alluded to earlier, Senator Manchin is uncomfortable with the funding mechanism. He doesn't like an increase in the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28. He also has made it clear that he does not believe that major legislation of this type should pass as a matter of course as the result of what's called budget reconciliation. Very quickly, to take you into the weeds, budget reconciliation is a process that generally can be used once per fiscal year, and it must be used pursuant to a budget resolution that specifies what provisions will be included under the reconciliation package. The provisions must deal exclusively with either revenue or expense. So it's very difficult to pass policy oriented legislative language under reconciliation. And it requires only 51 votes for passage. So again, you would need all 50, in this case, Dems, to line up in support of the package, and then Vice President Harris would have to vote for it. With Manchin as a question mark, with Senator Sinema as a question mark, with Senator Tester as a question mark, these are 3 Dems. It's hard to predict at this point that the 50 Democratic votes will be there for the package as currently conceived. This is why I suggested a few minutes ago that what we're more likely to see is a traditional surface transportation bill. Remember, we have to reauthorize surface transportation programs by September 30th, and we may see some of the so-called home infrastructure pieces, such as the wastewater and stormwater and drinking water infrastructure, perhaps the community college piece, perhaps the public school piece, and so on. But it's going to be a serpentine, if you will, path to passage. It's going to be a difficult path to passage, and it's going to take a lot of paths that at the present time are really not even predicted. Bottom line, though, is I do believe something will pass that will constitute a significant investment in infrastructure that will include the kinds of projects that Steve Schultz just talked about. Brett, I'll yield to you for what your thoughts are. I'm sorry, yeah, Brett, with the goatee.
Yeah. Whatever. I'll try to wrap this up, and then we'll get into questions. I think we've laid out kind of the usual pitfalls and challenges to get anything through Congress, especially when the margins are as tight as Tim discussed a second ago. But I'm going to highlight the kind of the general reason why we wanted to present this for you is that there's multiple opportunities for counties, and what does it mean to you at the end of the day? Basically, what's going to, assuming something does pass, again, it's going to go through the process, and we'll get there at the end of the day. And I think all of us are relatively confident that something related to infrastructure, something related to investment in the country's various different transportation systems is going to occur. It's just a matter of when, how, and how big. Opportunities for counties and local governments. The money that comes from the highway bill, the traditional highway bill, the state DOT will get a large chunk of formula-driven money that then gets spit back out to you guys on the local side. And if that's an increase, that's great. That's more for your county roads. And I know the state budget just included a whole bunch of money for that as well. So hopefully you'll be able to do a lot of kind of the traditional paving and repair work. But this is most likely going to have like multiple transportation bills or infrastructure bills rolled up into one. The highway bill, the roads and bridges in your area, the water investment is going to be significant. That could be sewer, water, treatment plants, new pipes, new lines. So I'm sure you have projects that need to be upgraded somewhere in your counties. And then third, airports. For those that have a municipal airport in your locality, there is going to be money. So those are usually 3 separate bills where they do a highway bill, a water bill, and a air transportation bill. And it looks like they're going to put at least the funding of those 3 together into one big bill. There may not be some programmatic or policy changes, but we're definitely going to get the funding associated with them. So that's a huge chunk of money that's going to flow all at once, where usually it's spread out. So again, get your ducks in a row, start thinking about what projects you may want to proceed with. Second, and kind of the biggest chunk is what, or direct opportunity for you is what Schultz discussed, and that's the earmark, the direct congressionally directed spending, or whatever the appropriate politically correct term they're using for what is known as an earmark. And they'll be at multiple levels, the transportation bill and then the appropriations bills. The appropriations bills have 12 different bills. They all have, will move individually. Most likely a bunch of them will get packaged together before they become law. But again, the how-to doesn't really matter. It's what's in it and what's available to you for your use in your county. If you did not kind of get involved in the process this time, because those deadlines are in a matter of weeks, and maybe you're not going to be able to get your ducks in a row and everything submitted in time, or haven't met with your congressional representative to talk about the opportunities in front of you, this is absolutely something you want to be part of next year. The appropriations process, and we'll have a trial run and can continue to communicate with you how it went, and you can monitor it and see there are going to be hundreds of millions of dollars spent directed by the members of Congress to projects in their district over the next 6 to 9 months of the remaining part of the fiscal year. And we will be able to tell you directly who did what, how well it worked. There will be some counties that benefit, that were ready to go right away. And you'll be able to see that and say, well, you know, let's get our ducks in a row for the next time, because we're going to be able to navigate this process and get all the information presented to our member of Congress, meet with them, talk to them, and make sure you make a case for why you should get $5 million directly sent to you for a specific project that's eligible in the criteria that's set forth. So there's a lot of moving parts, of course, as always, but this is a tremendous opportunity for local governments to pursue direct funding. Again, an earmark that benefits you directly. You don't have to go through any sort of additional formula funding or wait for it to flow through the state DOT or some other state agency. That is probably the easiest and cleanest, and I'm sure you like that the most. That is a tremendous benefit that is back this fiscal year. We will continue to monitor it and see how it unfolds. As Mr. Schultz indicated, each member of Congress only gets 10 requests. That's new this year. It's new forever. It's never been like that. So, you know, just going throughout New York State, if you're in Taco's district, Stefanik's district, out in Buffalo and Brian Higgins' district, they only get 10 requests. So you got to not only get all your information in line, make sure you comply with the rules that were set forth, make sure the project is eligible based on the criteria set forth by the committee. You then have to convince your member of Congress that that project is one of the 10 best projects he or she could submit next fiscal year. So we'll continue to keep you updated on that, but that is kind of the huge opportunity for you, along with just a whole bunch of money that's going to come out through these various transportation agencies, and help you, kind of continue to keep track of that so that you're in line to get and make sure your projects are ready to go. I'd love to entertain any questions, unless David, Steve, or Tim have anything else to add.
Well, let's go to questions.
Well, first I want to say thank you for this presentation. Mark Levine, I'm the Deputy Director of the New York State Association of Counties. Before we jump to the attendee questions, and we have quite a few that are building up, and I encourage anybody, any attendees, to submit your questions now through the questions panel on your webinar, GoToWebinar dashboard. So we have a deadline coming up, right? Is the funding for those 10 projects per congressional member, is that funding already available, or are we talking about projects that will still need to get funding in the future?
I'll take that one.
The deadline that is April 28th through the 30th.
Sure.
So that is the deadline for individual members. So Annalise Stefanik to get her 10 vetted, and then to the committee. Her internal deadline to get let's say a request from somebody in Plattsburgh was last week, or even a few days before that. And so we're right in the middle of this process right now. That money has not been spent it will not be spent until that bill passes Congress and becomes law for the FY22 budget, or spending. So basically, you would request now, you work through the legislative process. Ideally, it doesn't always happen, and it hasn't happened a lot recently. At the end of the federal fiscal year in September, the end of September, October 1 being the next year, the bill would already be passed, and then funding would be available.
And that funding will come through the American Jobs Plan or the traditional highway bill. Where will that funding come from?
There'll be two separate.
I'm sorry, Steve, go ahead.
I was going to say, and to be real clear, we have appropriations here. That's every year. That's FY22 starting in October. Separately, what Steve and Tim spent a lot of time talking about is a transportation reauthorization bill. That's once every 5 years. Those projects are being submitted now by members. That's the list of things, the requirements that we listed out. And both of those things will be spent through block grants to states in a lot of different ways. But for appropriations, that'll be split out. It's almost like writing a grant into law. So if I have, let's say I want to do a burn grant, so it's going to be a public safety project. It's going to be an anti-violence project. It's going to be to the tune of, $150,000. That would be basically DOJ would contact the winner and say, you received this funding or, et cetera. Here's how it's going to work. Here's what's going to be required of you to do. And it's really much more like a federally directed grant as opposed to the transportation piece. Tim, something to add?
Just one piece real quick. Unlike the previous iteration of member-directed spending, earmarks, whatever you want to call it, an element of the consideration of whether or not the earmark will be included in legislation is the extent to which the project sponsor identifies how the rest of the project will be funded. So I'm just making something up here, but let's say there's a $5 million project in Onondaga County, and the earmark request is for $2 million. How that remaining $3 million will be funded and how certain that funding is will play into whether the $2 million will be included in an appropriations bill, whereas in past years, at least when I was there, that was not a consideration. And that led to lots of money being sequestered, so to speak, but never obligated because the project was never fully funded. So that's important for people who are making requests to understand.
Great. So for county officials who are on the call today, please call your congressperson after this webinar to find out when their deadline is, if the deadline is already passed, if they can fit you in, submit your projects ASAP. First question, is it true that only 30% of the American Jobs Plan is about traditional infrastructure?
It depends on how you define traditional infrastructure. The highway piece is round numbers. I think it's $625 billion out of a $2.3 billion project. So $2.3 trillion. So I'm doing the math in my head, but that looks to be about 30%. But historically, water infrastructure projects have been considered infrastructure. Port projects have been considered infrastructure projects. Inland waterways projects have been considered infrastructure. School construction, community college support. So clearly the so-called care infrastructure piece falls outside of any previous definition of infrastructure, as does the R&D piece. The first two pieces, which comprise more than half the bill, would arguably fall under the heading of traditional infrastructure.
Great.
Yeah, I think that number comes from when you say you're going to do an infrastructure bill in years past in Congress, they kind of meant the highway bill, which was a highway and transit bill, but it's the surface transportation. It's got a million different names. But when they use that number, they're referring to, we have to do a highway bill because it expires September 30th. So that's what the T&I committee is moving forward with now. And that would comprise about 30% of what the president proposed in the American Jobs Act. But to Tim's point, we would consider water infrastructure and airport infrastructure projects traditional infrastructure. Like I said before, they're taking 3 of those bills and kind of wrapping them into one. But when they say 30%, they're basically talking about the highway and roads, bridges, and mass transit piece of it. The traditional highway bill makes up about 30% of the American.
The other thing I would say is we keep talking about infrastructure, as well we should, but the title of the bill is the American Jobs Act. So the goal of the $2.3 trillion expenditure is to both solidify existing jobs and create new jobs. And all 4 pieces of infrastructure, broadly defined, do that.
Okay, so one question I had as you were talking, making your presentation is, so this is 3 bills going into one, or traditionally 3 bills going into one. So is the American Jobs Act going to replace those 3 bills, or will it be in addition to the traditional reauthorization that happens every end of September?
It would replace them all. If it is enacted in a similar fashion of that it was presented by President Biden and not split up based on just the process Congress has to undergo to get it done, you would get one big jobs bill that replaces the surface transportation bill, the water resources development bill, and the airport investment bill. It would replace all 3 of those and then still add more on top of it.
Okay, great, thank you.
I'm sorry, for the current time. I mean, there will always be surface transportation bills going forward, for example, because you have to reauthorize highway programs. What is it, Steve, every 3 years or every 5 years? You have to every 5 years. So for now, we're talking about 3 bills being subsumed into one, but going forward, there will be a return to traditional ways of handling this.
Okay, great, thank you. Experts say the economy will add 16.3 million jobs without the infrastructure bill or the American Jobs Act. How many more jobs will be created if this bill is approved? I know you can't say with any definity, but
this is where
actually, I can tell you what Buttigieg has been talking about. He uses the number 19, so it's an additional 2.6, 2.3, whatever the math is. He's been using 19. So that's they had an economic study that said if this was enacted into law, it would be 19. So that's the number they're using, the administration.
But the delta there is about 2.5 million. So sort of an honest accounting is that if this bill were to be enacted into law, over and above normal expected growth in the economy, we would see that additional 2.5 to 3 million additional jobs.
Great, thank you. I remind attendees, if you have any questions, please submit them.
One other point to bear in mind is it would solidify the existing jobs, the annual maintenance of which is not something that can be taken for granted.
Okay. Do earmarks need to go through the House of Representatives, or can they also go through the Senate? And if they do go through the House, because it is a piece of legislation that would be turned into law, what's the Senate's role in that sort of process? So the first one is, do earmarks have to go through the House? And then the second question is, what's the Senate role here?
So earmarks could go through the House or the Senate. And Tim and Steve jump in here, but earmarks can go through the House and the Senate. And I've been in the position where, we've worked with clients to request things in the House or in the Senate. And the way it worked previously was that, based on seniority, committee assignment, and other things, members had a certain kind of rough allotment of what they could push forward, and the same in the Senate. And it was up to the member or the senator to decide how they wanted to split that up. The Senate has not come out with rules yet. And so that's why we're very, very House focused, because the Senate kind of hasn't decided what they're going to do. And I think that's an evolving situation. The House, however, has, they've come out with clear guidelines, deadlines, et cetera. But, you have and ideally you would be in the House and the Senate. And that way it wouldn't be even a conferenceable item, because, what happens is the House passes their version, the Senate passes their, go over to the Senate, they'll pass their version, and they need to come up with a compromise version, and then it could be, accepted by both houses. And if you're in both bills, you're definitely going to make it. It's kind of similar to the one houses in New York. But obviously it's a little different in New York because you have the governor. But for the most part, if you're in the House and the Senate and federally, you're going to pass. But the Senate hasn't figured out what its process is going to be, and we have been checking constantly as to what that's going to look like. Steve or Tim, I don't know if you've heard anything different, but that's our understanding is that the Senate has not come out with it yet.
That's correct.
Okay, when you make the comment, because we have the governor, then the counties who are submitting these projects should have the support of the executive chamber when they're submitting them. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I was actually comparing the process to trying to get something in a one house in New York State, et cetera. And then, ideally you'd be in each budget, and then you go to your three-way negotiations. And federally, what's different is if you're in the House and the Senate bill, there's not any negotiation at that point. The president would have to veto the entire bill if they did not want it, and that's not going to happen more than likely with this type of with the setup we have now, right? You have a Democratic House, you have a Senate that can pass things, for the most part, and this will pass. This doesn't, this will probably pass. Well, who knows in DC these days? But it's a little different. No, as far as projects go within an appropriations bill, no, it's local stakeholders. It's, it could be your state DOT, it could be, local law enforcement, it could be a school, just totally depends on the project. It's really about the local stakeholders, your member, your local government, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. If the infrastructure bill follows the reconciliation route, how long would desired municipal bond provisions be cut short, or would long desired municipal bond provisions be cut short because of a 10-year horizon?
I'm going to sort of feel my way along to an answer to that question. Reconciliation requires that all financial implications of the subject piece of legislation be wholly contained within a 10-year budget window. So if municipal bond provisions, so if the question is, can a project be accomplished in part by earmark spending and in part by municipal bonding? Is that the question? No?
No,
The question is, if the infrastructure bill follows the reconciliation route, would long desired municipal bond provisions be cut short because of a 10-year horizon?
Steve, you're on mute. Steve, you're on mute.
10 years. It has to be within a 10-year window. But it has to be within a 10-year window, and that is as required by reconciliation. Will they be able to move forward with this? This is one of the biggest reasons why the Democrats are still courting Republican support, because the traditional highway bill has a whole bunch of mechanisms and programs and policies that probably would not be able to be passed via the reconciliation process because they don't have a significant outlay, significant impact on the federal outlays, which is the kind of core definition of what's available to use through reconciliation process. So it's a really good question that we don't quite have an answer to yet, because there's a whole bunch of things that the Senate parliamentarian is going to have to rule on in order for it to comply with the reconciliation rules. And we could guess how she's going to rule, but you don't really know until the ruling comes through. So if you go from the beginning, it'll move through the House normally, gets to the Senate, and it has to undergo what's called a bird bath, named after former Senator Robert Byrd, where they'll scrub every provision and make sure that it complies with the tight reconciliation rules for just kind of comparison purposes, if people remember during the COVID relief bill, they included a $15 minimum wage increase on the House side, and the Senate parliamentarian ruled that that wouldn't comply with the rules and wouldn't be able to be included. That's going to happen with a lot of these provisions that normally would go through with a highway bill. And so that's going to be one of the challenges. It's a really good question that I don't think any of us could give you a definitive answer right now until we see, do they structure it differently? Do they make it comply with the 10-year window? Do they write it in a different fashion? Does the parliamentarian let it go through? Too many variables right now.
Okay, go ahead, Congressman.
I'm sort of common sensing this, and Steve is quite right. We have to research it, and we need to know more. But if there is, let us say, a wastewater infrastructure project for which an earmark is requested successfully, and the balance of the project is going to be a 0% interest loan through the SRF, that would be repaid over a 30-year period. I believe those can happily coexist. Okay, because it would be the earmark piece that would have to be funded through a 10-year budget window, but the overall project could be funded by other means through a mechanism that goes beyond the 10-year budget window. But we have to do the research to be certain that what I just said is accurate.
Thank you. Steve Hoover, if you have a follow-up, please type that in and I can ask a follow-up on that. Thank you. Because so many projects related to infrastructure that were funded by disaster recovery funding were delayed because of COVID-19, and we would have to request funding under the new bill to complete. Will other infrastructure related funding streams be extended as additional support for infrastructure? So will previously allocated funding that had to be delayed, will those be extended?
Does he have a specific example of what type of funding that is?
Rebecca, if you have a specific example, could you submit that?
Anything that was delayed means, you know, if it wasn't rescinded, the money is still there. Just a matter of making sure you kind of fill out the requisite forms to be able to use it. I know we have another client who didn't use funds that they were awarded a federal grant for because of the COVID, and just it wasn't prudent to spend the match part at that time, and they were given an extension and are proceeding with it now. So that's why I wonder what exactly account they're looking at or what the project was. That's a kind of a specific one to the individual account.
Okay, here we go with a follow-up. CDBG, DR, HM, GP, Sandy allocations that got a 1-year extension, but we need 3 years.
That's Sandy money. That's old.
Yeah.
That would probably require legislative language in a appropriations bill, right, Schultz? This is like reapportioning money. Tim, if we got a project for you years ago and you didn't spend it all in a 3-year window, you could go back into the appropriations bill and insert language to extend it, or it's almost like redoing an earmark. You kind of got one 4 years ago, and for whatever reason, permitting didn't allow it to go forward. You could get a language to extend it in an appropriations bill, but that one, just off without having too many details, Schultz, sounds like they need a legislative fix.
I would agree.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking the same thing, and we used to, you know, reprogram dollars for, and essentially it was some of the things that Tim was mentioning, where you'd have orphaned earmarks, projects that didn't go, but they appropriated money for, and so you'd go into an appropriations bill, and that was your pay for, essentially, that extra dollars. But for this, it's, you know, it's CDBG, so, you know, I mean, it's block granted down. I think an appropriations bill would be a good place to start, honestly. Because you could provide, you know, that type of language. You could even maybe do, I don't know if you can do it in a report, but report language. And again, there's bill language, there's report language. Report language isn't necessarily binding, but it gives, you know, it gives some guidance. But I think you could start with an appropriations bill. But I would also honestly work with, you know, work with HUD on that as well, and at least, you know, explore that. Yeah. an interesting.
Hey, Jeanette, can we
it's an
turn to
interesting
the
challenge.
last slide where there's contact information for Envision Strategies, and Rebecca may want to follow up directly with an email with that question to Envision Strategies.
Yeah, we might be able to answer more, Mark, if we had more detail. That's an interesting, unique one that we would have to kind of research a little bit.
Yeah,
So
Great, thank you.
And I would say, generally, certainly, any questions that folks have, that's David Carroll's information right there. It's our Albany office. It's our front line and David's email. We would love to, answer any questions or, dive deeper, just have more discussion about it. We're available.
Is there a monetary limit on the congressional project request, the community projects that you referenced? Is there a monetary limit to those?
I haven't seen one yet. Have you guys?
Oh, I
The
thought it
only
was
one you can convince your member of Congress to request. That's the limit, what they're willing to submit.
yeah, the only limit that we're aware of right now is 10 requests per member.
Okay.
But I'll tell you one thing, this is one real quick, one important point. I have seen people that would go in and they know, let's say that there's $25 billion in an account and they'll go in and they'll request 24. You're not going to be very successful if you're requesting 24 out of a $25 billion account, right? And so that, those projects that are ill-conceived from a dollar amount will just get kicked out.
There has been talk of having an overall limit for congressionally directed spending of 1% of domestic discretionary spending, which, domestic discretionary spending, if you add defense to it, is about 1.2 trillion. So 1% of that is whatever it is. I'm not good at math in my head, except figuring out batting averages. Okay.
Well, speaking of math, we have our last question, looks like a math question from Steve Hoover in Chemung County. When I divide the cost of this bill at 2.3 trillion, oh, we have another question coming in, but hold on. When I divide the cost of this bill, 2.3 trillion, by 2.7 million in additional jobs, the cost per additional job would be about $852,000. Is that correct?
I'm going to trust the math. I don't know.
Sure.
Okay, next question from David Turner. CDBG and others require some guarantee of jobs in their typical application. Rural and impoverished communities that could be highly competitive for new developments but lack the appropriate basic infrastructure never get the chance to attract investors. Can these requirements be changed so communities without infrastructure can actually get some?
I would say the easiest way to get a project in an area like that is through an earmark, because they don't have restrictions. There's no, you don't, if your member of Congress wants you to get money for that project, you can get it. It doesn't have to, it has to comply with the eligibility that the committee set forth, but it doesn't have all the other requirements of certain job creations. There was, if you go back and look at the slideshows, there's nothing in there about job creation. Project eligibility and all the appropriations information that's been sent out. And we've filled out several for clients already. Nowhere in there did you have to project the number of jobs that it could create or anything like that. So it's really, if the member of Congress thinks that that's a worthwhile project in his or her district, and you have that access and influence and have made that case, you can get money directly and you don't need to worry about those other requirements.
Right.
And
let me say one more thing too, is that, go ahead, Mark.
Well, no, go ahead. On the same topic, is there a scoring mechanism that you know of? Because maybe not all of the 10 projects that are submitted will get enacted. So do we know of any scoring mechanism for evaluating these projects?
There is no scoring mechanism. This is, quite honestly, this is a member's prerogative. If a member of Congress wants a project in their district and they are willing to make it one of their top 10 submissions, and to what Schultz just said a second ago, you're not requesting 25 million out of a $26 million pot. But if you are kind of a reasonable earmark request of $1 million out of a $100 million pot, and your member of Congress thinks it's a good use of federal resources, it's really just a parochial interest. What is good for that district? Members want to provide for whatever reason they want to provide, whether it's they love the project, they love the area, it helps them politically. It doesn't really matter to you. If you made the case and it works, there is no criteria, and there's really the evaluation is really just, does it comply with the rules that the committee set forth, which is more so than anything these days, is the money going to be spent this year, and are there, it's not going to benefit a relative, or it's not going to have any sort of corruption associated with it. But if you can spend all the money this year and that's going to complete the project, then that's pretty much what they're looking for.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce that point that Steve just made. Remember, previous earmarks pre-09, 010 did not require a presentation of how the rest of the project would be funded. That is now required. And clearly, the appropriators do not want to award earmarks, encumber money, and then have that money not spent when they, in the process of doing so, they are saying no to worthy projects that might be completed more quickly. So having that unfunded piece be designated, and designating the funding for the non-earmarked part of the project is essential.
And Mark, what I was thinking about, kind of adding also to that, and thinking about rural infrastructure and trying to where you're going to start. Some of the things that we work on with clients are, I manage our federal grants practice, and we will structure project plans for federal funding, whatever that is. It could be a grant, it could be other kind of colors of money, but regardless, if you have a vision for what kind of infrastructure, what kind of project you want to do, and you want to set the groundwork for that, and you need utility, water, roads, whatever it happens to be, and you can build up to whatever that project is. If it's, let's say, it's an industrial park, but that you're 3 steps behind that. It's about putting a plan together that can build on these things, and some of that may be a grant, it may be it may be a loan guarantee for a public-private partnership. It could be an earmark, or it could be a transportation project request. But it's having that kind of holistic view to come in and know all the different things, all the different kind of opportunities that are out there, to put it together and drive towards whatever your project's going to be. If that is an industrial park, an airport, a wharf, whatever.
That's a great way to end, Steve. Thank you very much. We're at our 75-minute mark, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us today for this discussion on the American Jobs Act, or the potential American Jobs Act, and what it might mean for communities across New York. We again thank Envision Strategies. We thank our panel. I will give one last opportunity for anybody on the panel to 1 more minute for closing. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've said it all, and we would certainly welcome questions from the people who we can't see on the screen, and also, Mark, from you and your colleagues. But I think we've made the presentation that hopefully we intended to make.
Great, thank you. And our counties have our county officials have some homework to do. We need to put our projects together and get them in the queue. So thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Bye.